Well, so thank you so much, for inviting me, and welcome to everyone to this amazing workshop. It's just a great honor to open this wonderful workshop for you and to be with you. And thank you for tolerating that I'm not with you in person. I'm coming to you from Massachusetts, the unceded territory of the Nipmuc and Pocumtuck, who have stewarded this land and continue to do so. And I guess I want to start out by saying you have a really big agenda for these next 3 days of workshopping together. And so I'm going to try to touch on all of those themes, but of course that will leave you probably, well, unsatisfied with me, but ready to go into your breakout groups. So that would be a perfect resolution to this. So let me start by, let me see how I can advance this. Here we go. Let me just take you right here to the coast, and I'm going to use Virginia imagery, but of course you all are familiar with this from the places where you are located. You know, what we're talking about when we're thinking about resilience is a range of activities, a range of interventions that really differ in the depths to which they disrupt people's lives. You know, this quote here says a lot about that, whether it's just a minor adjustment or actually uprooting from the places where we live. And, you know, we also know that ultimately, given the trends in sea level, which I'm not going to belabor here, but with those trends, we're not going to be able to protect everything in place and keep all the things that we love about the coast. You can't endlessly put a seawall or heart protection up to protect you against meters of sea level rise if you also want these kinds of beaches. And of course, they're already nourished here. So anyway, and we also know it's a very different thing if you're in the shoes of the homeowner of the house on the left or in the boots of the one on the right. And so to me, these are sort of the central starting points for what I want to talk about. How can we be useful as scientists, as practitioners in this particular space? How do we co-create the science that actually will move the needle on this? And how do we work with the stakeholders in all the different places and across the range that I just depicted in those introductory slides? So, you know, to do that, what do we know about how to become relevant, how to be useful in that, you know, increasingly fast-paced and difficult world to work in? And how do we center equity in the middle of that? I'll end with a few slides on sort of how do we track success and how do we, you know, actually work towards success, and offer some tools to you there. Hopefully that will set us up for the conversation. So let's start here with this question. What does it mean to be useful with science in coastal resilience building? What does it actually mean? We probably all have different interpretations when we ask, you know, how can I be of use? Some of you might be interested in simply providing benchmarks of the state of the knowledge, and that is super helpful. It can be very, very helpful for people who don't have the time to go through reams and reams of journal articles, right? Or assessments for that matter. It might also be, you know, that you are actually interested in fostering a greater understanding of how science works and get people engaged with the science in the hopes that maybe they don't dismiss it or they take it seriously or they have a stake in it themselves. Maybe your goal really would be of improving the relationships between those who produce the science and who use it. A very worthy way of being useful. Another one might be that you actually want to make sure that the information is more useful and in fact used while you keep doing interesting science. And the final piece is maybe the ultimate driver, and that is to support better decisions and outcomes. I think we jump over all the other ones that I just mentioned and get to this one. I think there is benefit and usefulness to each one of those, and each of us has a different comfort zone where in this spectrum between science production and science use, you know, where we want to play along that. So I can't tell you what your what your favorite spot in that is, but just maybe a question you can ask yourself where you find yourself along that particular spectrum. I've done quite a bit of research to ask people who use science, what do they need from the science? When is it actually useful to them? You know, we often ask this as scientists, how can we be useful? And we have an idea. Sometimes we don't even ask the practitioners about what will be useful to them. So I just went over to the user side and said, well, what would be useful to you? And the first thing they said is, well, sometimes I have a very specific question, a very specific need. I need this piece of data, this piece of information. Could you please provide that for me? So in that case, a scientist would be responsive to an expressed request, right? The practitioner policymaker knows exactly what they need. And your job is to help basically answer the call. That's a really important way to be helpful. A second one is where the practitioner or policymaker might also know what they want to do. They're ready to go, say, with a particular policy initiative or a particular project, but they need to get the public or elected officials or other influential partners in this to come along, to buy into it, to support what this action is. In that instance, you might be playing a role, excuse me, giving talks to educate people about the issue, being sort of this neutral source of information, or you might be helping people to train them to use certain decision support tools, or any way in which you can be supportive to move things along without you necessarily generating new science, but making it accessible to the people who need to come along with a decision. The next two are actually quite different. To be generative, what that means is, what I heard from practitioners is that sometimes they don't know how to solve a problem. They don't have a good solution, or the solution they used to use doesn't work anymore. And your job as a researcher might be to generate new solutions. So very different than the first two where the solution is known, right? So that can be a very, very helpful way in which you can support decision-making to move forward. And the last one is actually a really interesting one, and maybe the most difficult one, certainly one that doesn't, it's not a good place to start necessarily, and that is to be constructively critical. And what is meant by that is, sometimes practitioners, agency staff, they know something isn't working, but they need basically that independent voice from some external credible source to say, you know what, the science shows this isn't good. This isn't good enough. It doesn't do this, that, and the other thing. Maybe around equity, maybe around the effectiveness of a particular solution anymore, or the negative side effects or something. So oftentimes that can be then combined with being generative and coming up with a better solution. But that one is really tricky. And, as I said, it can be enormously helpful and is quite distinct from the other ones. What makes science useful? What have we learned? What's important here to point out is something is not useful to everyone to the same degree. It's not something inherent in the science. It is something that is attributed to the science. So, if you do research that has local specificity, or is, links one issue with another, or comes at a really good time vis-a-vis decision-making, then it becomes relevant, then it's salient. If it comes 2 weeks after the decision was made, even if it's high resolution and everything else, sorry, it is no longer useful, right? It is no longer salient. So really important to keep in mind both scale issues, temporal issues, and just making it, connect with what decision makers are worried about already. Credibility is a really important attribution. Who did the science? Do we trust them? Have they interacted with other science around this? Is it transparent how this assessment was done, right? Those kinds of things are really, really important. And sometimes, when a practitioner doesn't know whether, who the researchers are, they look at the affiliation, or they look at, where the funding came from. Those kinds of things can be sort of clues toward under what circumstance you would consider the science to be credible. The next one, legitimacy, actually touches on the issue of equity already, and that is, heard from all the relevant parties that, in the design, in the problem formulation, in the consideration of different parts of evidence, and so on and so forth. If it doesn't have those three things as the basis, it is incredibly unlikely that your science will ever be useful and helpful to any decision maker. I'll add a couple others that have come out sort of a little bit later through research from other researchers. One is your science has to make the life of a decision maker easier. If it doesn't do that, why would they bother to, they're busy people. Why would they bother to take on your work? And also it makes it easier if it's easily updatable, if you will. So if that can be done and it can be easily integrated into existing decision procedures, that makes the science simply more useful. Now, that's just all about the science, the knowledge per se. But let's just for a minute talk about how we produce that science. We are in a really interesting situation, and certainly with what's coming along the coast and the waters rising, I think that is a really good context to exemplify what I'm trying to say here. Increasingly, we're asked to give really fast answers. Stuff is happening faster and faster. Please get us, solutions, get us science as fast as you can. And the more scientists dig into this, the more we see the complexity of issues, the more we ask for more time to understand the issue, right? So we don't have time, we have less and less time, and we ask for more time to understand it. Now, the implication of that is that there is a risk that science essentially becomes irrelevant just because we're never going to be on time, if you will, when you think back to that salience point that I just made. Another risk is, of course, that we make decisions increasingly uninformed by what we do know, or when it comes too late. Now, how do we deal with that? That's a really big challenge that I see. Very briefly, just to give you a little bit of context, we used to do science basically where taxpayers gave money to the researchers. They went away, did their thing through some really shady channels. Basically what is depicted here is a pipeline. Some answers came out eventually, and it was assumed that there was going to be a societal benefit. Sort of like, the linear model of science and society interactions: fund us, trust us, leave us alone, don't even bother us, right? You're going to benefit from this. Well, that was pretty clearly criticized as oftentimes producing science that doesn't have enough application, that doesn't have enough societal benefit. And so, this particular model was replaced by something a lot more complex, which is essentially that we develop a shared understanding of the problem, develop an integrated or common shared vision of where we want to go, drawing on the different parts of society that are interested in this particular issue, integrate across different kinds of disciplines and bodies of knowledge, and then implement solutions together and look at it together to see what are we learning from it. Did it work? Did it solve the problem? If not, let's go, reshuffle and rethink it and go at it again. So this particular model of co-design and co-production is a really important one. And of course, when you now connect what I said earlier about the qualities of science that make it more or less useful, co-production enhances essentially the possibility of things being salient and relevant and timely and, credible. People understand how the knowledge was generated and so forth. So I strongly encourage you to consider, in all the work that you're going to do over the next few days here, is to really think through how can we build these kinds of relationships to define the research agendas together, the projects that we want to work on. What's interesting about this, there's different degrees of this linking that we've observed in the literature and in practice, really. One is sort of, people just relatively superficially link with each other, where essentially it's like, I'm looking for how can I better disseminate my research results to users. So, working, I don't know, maybe with extension or hiring a communicator or something like that. There is also the more involved version of actually connecting with users to at least frame the research question and then interpret the results. But essentially the whole work of doing the research, you go away, do it by yourself as scientists, and the practitioners go off and do their thing in the meantime. A yet more involved version of that is to actually identify the research questions together and designing the projects, even collecting data and doing analysis and deciding together on what are the most appropriate outputs from this research together. So that's a much deeper level of collaboration. And then finally, in the co-production, it is really that you're helping as a scientist to empower and build capacity with all your colleagues and partners, whether or not they're scientists, to bring all the different types of knowledge together and generate and evaluate knowledge claims together, integrate different knowledges. So in each case, you need very different levels of interaction and support mechanism, if you will. In the first case, as I mentioned, maybe just a dedicated outreach capacity. In the second case with matchmaking, you just occasionally engage, you know, and have maybe someone who is dedicated to do that. In the collaboration, it'd be very helpful to have a boundary organization or individuals who really are, you know, dancing between the practitioners and the scientists, and who navigate that space and are accountable to both in equal measure. And in the final case, you know, you're really setting up entirely new institutional structures and processes to work that deeply with each other. That one, I think, is truly transformative, both for all the parties involved. Now, here are a couple of lessons from that, and that I think comes back to this question of how do we do this kind of work under growing time pressures, if you will. What we know, I just mentioned this to you, is that when users attribute to the science a sense of credibility, relevance, and legitimacy, they're more likely to consider the science in decision-making. That's just, you know, that's well documented. Now, when does scientific information become more usable? Well, when you get together doing this kind of process that I just described, producing a shared understanding of the problem, the decision context, which allows you to tailor the science, deliver it in a timely and reliable manner, and really improve the efficiency and effectiveness of decision-making. Now, when does that actually then lead to a greater likelihood that it's actually used? Well, what we've learned basically is that when there is a more intense level of interaction between knowledge producers and users, they're simply building the trust in this information. They become more comfortable, they build the capacity, the knowledge of how to do this, the skills to use this information well. They see the risks and the benefits of use, and they have the necessary trust that makes them jump over the hurdle of actually doing something new. And what do we know about trust building? That one is a matter of mutuality, intentionality, both competence on both sides, follow through on any promises made, and simply a matter of time, which is what we don't have much of, right? So what I've learned in this, and I can go on for a very long time about this, is that the investment in time, and thus in trust building, takes time on the front end, and it will make everything else faster. So it is absolutely worth doing it, even under, you know, the growing pressure of circumstances. Why? Because if you don't do it, you simply produce science that doesn't meet any of the criteria that you see here, and is essentially wasted time. All the effort that you put into, if it's not usable, if it's not used, it's not going to make better decisions. It simply sits on a shelf. So this investment, I implore you, is worth making, and it is time saving in the end. Now, getting to the point of how do we then center equity in that? I want to offer you what I have come to summarize under 7 A's, the 7 A's of equity and justice and engagement. And that is to think very hard, and I really mean that, think very hard, not in any superficial way, about who and how do people access the information that you might produce and or have to share. And I I want to say it in that way because, some of you are practitioners and you actually have information to share as well. Well, if it sits in some kind of format or on a very well hidden website on a government website, it is of no use to anybody. If it can't be found, it's not accessible. Is it accessible to people who are blind, or, in any other form that might make it more difficult for some people to access information? That needs to be thought through. Can people actually attend meetings that you might want to have to begin this process of trust building and collaboration? Do they have the time? When is it during the day? Is that when, most of us are in jobs? Well, people of lower income tend to have multiple jobs. So can they actually attend? Can you go to them? Is it not only like, how can you lower the hurdles, if you will, for them to be able to come? If you're having it in the evening, well, it needs childcare. You need to offer food. Can they get there by public transportation? Is there parking? Can you reduce the cost for them to participate? Really, really important. Accommodations for all of those who face challenges, and that's the access of information at this point is not exactly the same. Because, you might be perfectly capable physically and mentally and all the other ways. But if your website of information is deeply hidden, if your research is behind a paywall, it doesn't have anything to do with physical ability or not, right? But in this point here, it's really about physical access, accommodation for those with hearing vision challenges, even trainings. Many people who would like to participate in a public issue, say around coastal adaptation, might feel shy to participate because they feel, oh, I'm not a climate scientist. They don't even know yet what it's about, but they've simply had made up their mind that it's something that they're not qualified for. So really helping them see that they don't need that, or, in what ways their insights, their knowledge is absolutely essential to what you do. That's really important. Acknowledging land, customs, culture, history, wherever you are, that might be a really important element to creating that trust and relationship to the people that you're working with. I don't need to go into the details here, but I would strongly encourage you that wherever you are located, that you learn about what those customs and cultural ways of being, appropriate ways of being, that you should be honoring what they are. Attention to epistemic justice is a really interesting one and challenging for many scientists. We are socialized to believe that our knowledge is somehow better and more reliable and whatnot than everybody else's way of knowing, but that is not epistemic justice. How we know the world can be, there are many ways to know the world, and giving that space in what you do is something that scientists have to unlearn a whole bunch of training and relearn new things to make space for that. Alignment of your intent and meaningful engagement. You can say whatever you want to say about, oh, let's do engagement, but if it's just a box that you check and it is not meaningful engagement and it doesn't lead to anything and people don't see their input being reflected and respected, you're wasting their time. And of course, we're not supposed to do that. So we really have to think hard about how to do that. I strongly encourage you to work with people who are experts in engagement processes to do this. And then the last point to me is, that's a normative statement. The whole thing is a normative statement for all intents and purposes, but to me, it feels absolutely essential in my work at this point in time, late as we are and as white-bodied people coming to this, but to really consider very carefully what purposes, what systems, what powers we serve with the science that we do. So, you have anti-racist choices every step of the way in this process to make. And I think ultimately this is what is asked for if we talk about equitable coastal resilience. Now, what's interesting to me, and I want to emphasize this, is, you can check all these 7 A's and do your best and stay still pretty superficial. in all of this. Think about what are the challenges that people encounter when they try to adapt, try to make a change, try to, become more resilient. Well, the first level is that, they essentially run into barriers, particularly people of lower wealth, run into all kinds of barriers to be able to access resources, to access, the technical assistance, the practices that are available. Policies are stacked often against them. Very minute things like, not so, it's not minute in the sense of the impact of it, but it doesn't look like a big thing, but benefit cost ratios, particular regulations, redlining, I mean, all of that, right? Those are the kinds of situations that have created the inequities that we're now trying to undo. Well, underneath that is how did we get to those particular policies? Who was in the room who made those decisions? Well, that has everything to do with relationships, connections, and the power dynamics among those who are in city governments, in state governments, in the federal government at various levels. And underneath that is the thing we don't ever talk about, and that is how we think about not just equity, how we think about the earth, how we think about, sea level rise, or you name it, how we live with each other, right? Those are the taboos we do not mention. And as long as we don't change those, ultimately, it will remain a very, very superficial Band-Aid approach to coastal resilience. So I strongly encourage you in your investigation of the vulnerabilities and the situation that people live in to really look into the deeper dynamics of how did we get here, and, is a small tweaking of a particular coastal policy, is that going to change things, or do we need to look more deeply? What does that mean for where the interventions really ought to be? Now, to get to help people make those choices to whether it's adapting in place or relocating, helping people to recognize the inevitability of that there is a path that we all have to be on now in coastal areas, which is to go from in situ adaptation all the way to relocation, which is, the thing we all don't want to touch and talk about. We all still assume that certain areas will simply not be, abandoned, but I think that's an illusion. We can talk about why that is, but to recognize that is one thing. To then see actually how you possibly could get there, to taking those voluntary and eventually necessary steps, not imposed on you, but as being walked through. That's a really important piece. If you don't see that path, you're just going to resist, right? And so helping people see that there is a path. You can do this for so long, and then comes this, and then comes this. That is how we need to now talk about coastal adaptation. And then having people to actually, help you essentially through the planning process to make that happen, also to implement it ultimately. That is what we have learned from the relocation programs from around the country. The best ones of those have a technical and social support, if you will, to helping people both from where they leave to all the way where they are being received. So I really encourage you to not assume just because you drop an option into or do a little bit of outreach or whatever, that's not enough. You really have to walk people through this entire path from recognizing it all the way to making it happen. And so I want to encourage you to think about how do you enter those kinds of conversations. Well, whether you're a researcher or whether you're an extension specialist or whether you are a planner, how do you enter it? I think we don't talk about this nearly enough, that it'd be really interesting if you, in preparation for those kinds of conversations, think about how you feel about loss and endings. How would it be if you had to leave? What are your own fears of having such a difficult conversation? How good are you at letting go? You might, but I'm trying to say here, prime the empathy pump. Is this really hard, what we're asking people to do? You might hold judgments about, why are they not leaving? Why are they not, accepting that they need to retreat? Well, If all your belongings, especially as a low income, low wealth family, if all your income is in your house, that might be just one bridge too far, right? So I think it really behooves us to, as a supporter, if you will, or as an opener of those conversations, to really think where we are on all of these difficult choices. Really helpful if you know the language and the preferred language, and also the places where people are uneasy, cultural background and how they talk about coastal adaptation, possibly a retreat, maybe that's a taboo still. Know the demographics and economics of the town where you're working. You know, you're going to meet with an individual, not just a planner or an elected official. You're meeting someone who has very distinct personal individual characteristics. Know them, get to know them, know what their attitudes are toward government interventions, toward climate change. What are the social relations in that place? And of course, you need to know the stuff, if you will, the geography, what's happened there, what's the history, what other experiences have people had in that place. I strongly encourage you to learn something about trauma-aware communication, because in many of those places, they have gone through disasters recently. So you coming to talk about sea level rise or, those sorts of things might just trigger them in that place, and you will not find an open mind at that moment. So really important to think that through in preparation. Now, just the last bit that I want to quickly touch on is this whole question of how do you set yourself up for success? And I know you're going to be talking about indicators and tracking success and progress. I've done quite a bit of work in this over the last 10 years and found that people come to this question of how do they know we're succeeding again and again for 5 essential reasons. I mean, there's the overarching one. Yes, we have a responsibility to safeguard people, economies, infrastructure, and so on in coastal areas. But why do people want to know how well they're doing with coastal resilience building? Oftentimes it begins with the communication. How do we talk about this? You know, talking about success and how we would know that we're succeeding is a lot easier than talking about the doom and gloom. You know, sea level rise is coming and it's the end of it. So communicating hope and keeping people engaged in the process is a lot easier when you have something basically to show, a vision of where you're going and showing people we're moving along a trajectory to get to that. Also, you know, if you have diverse stakeholders to really define a shared vision among them, gives people a level of buy-in into the process. So really important to think about that from the get-go. Another reason is, you know, it's a lot easier when you do deliberate planning and decision-making that you set clear goals and you align your means to an end, right? You're internally consistent with what you're trying to do, or you're consistent and not at odds with other departments, other agencies, other levels of government doing different things. And, you know, you might be working in opposite direction. Oftentimes you need indicators to justify adaptation expenditures or proposals. And then once you get the money, really helpful to show, you know, here's what we've done with the money, and to be accountable to a funder, to the public, to elected officials. So basically a matter of good governance to actually have something to show for what you did. And then the last bit is that you actually want to see, you know, is it working? That might not always be the case. In fact, in this instance, it might be really, really helpful to track your failures, in inverted commas. The places where things fell short is really important as well. So this is the reason why we even bother with indicators. They can be super supportive for policy development. So even showing people this is where we are, you know, this is how we have progressed. This is why a certain project worked, can be really, really helpful to build support for policy, to strengthen strategies, to track the implementation. And, you know, you always will have to tell stories of progress and success to elected officials and so on and so forth. It also works the other way around, interestingly. Of course, policy can be put in place that will give us targets, that can tell us very clearly what kind of metrics we actually need. So it's really important to put what might feel like a scientific question, what are the best metrics to use, to put that in a policy context like I did in this particular slide. Now, what do you want metrics for? There might be 3 or so different things that you're interested in. Tracking the performance of the adapting entity. Is someone doing what they said they would? Or are you tracking the effectiveness of an adaptation strategy? Is it working? Say a natural buffer working as designed or expected. And the last one is, are we tracking the extent of adaptation, finance, and action? In other words, is it enough? Are we doing, enough? Are we overcoming barriers and so on? I have worked on this, as I said. I'm just going to quickly introduce you. There's a 10-year-long project working with coastal communities and the NERS, the National Estuarine Research Reserve System, and Sea Grant on the West Coast, and then the NERS around the country. And we've learned so much about what adaptation success means and how to develop the metrics that we built a toolkit. And I simply want to put this out there as a tool for you. I'm not going to talk much about it. What you won't find there is, here, I'm handing you the list of indicators and your work is done. What you're finding here is how to work through a process of developing the indicators together with the people that you're working with. And I really cannot emphasize enough how important that is. We do not agree right now on a common set of indicators. It's probably not useful to have all the same indicators across the country, no matter where you are. But this is a toolkit to help you build a tailored set of indicators for what you want to do. So just to quickly close, I guess I can't emphasize enough that if you want to get to equitable coastal resilience, it begins and ends and all the way through is about people and with people. It is not an add-on. It is the central hub of the wheel of everything that you're going to do. And that centers around trust building. And I want to maybe, say it in a different way, which is that really what you're doing by building that trust with stakeholders, particularly communities that have been ignored and disadvantaged for centuries essentially, is that you're in the middle of healing and repairing systems of inequity, as David Alexander pointed out in his introductory remarks. So by the time you get yourself set up, or how to get yourself set up for success really then is getting the process right and being engaged in this co-design process for adaptation with those who are affected. And then finally, on the point of measuring progress and success, especially looking, I want to encourage you to look for those deepest levers of change to build trust. It's helpful for communication. It's absolutely necessary for fundraising. It actually advances the science, and it is highly policy relevant. So do not think of this as the last thing you do. It's the first thing that you start with, actually, and it guides a lot of the research and the engagement that follows. So I'll stop here. Thank you so much.